Hey everybody, welcome to today's Banded Roundtable. If you've been with us before, you know how this works. At Banded, we just really want to have real conversations with real leaders. We don't just gather to trade business tips or ideas or thoughts. We gather because leadership is far more about who we are than what we do. So today, before we dive in, I think some of you might remember back in 2008, there was a musician named Dave Carroll who was flying United Airlines. And he watched, as many of us do, from the plane as the baggage guys were taking his bags and throwing them around. With his bag was his guitar, which is pretty valuable for a musician. And he watched these guys just kind of toss his guitar roughly around. And sure enough, when he got there, he opened up and the guitar was broken, completely destroyed. So he tried for months and months to get United to fix it. No one listened. So he did what every good songwriter would do. He wrote a song. And the song was called United Breaks Guitars, which they did. It ended up going viral on YouTube, millions of views. Within a week, United stock dropped 10%. That is roughly $180 million in value because one customer story spread faster than the PR machine could manage it or could spin it. So there's a huge leadership lesson in this for all of us, and that is communication isn't just about passing information, it's about reputation, it's about trust. And sometimes the difference between good communication and bad communication can cost us dearly, whether that's financially or whether that's through our reputation or whether that's through relationships. All of those things can happen. So today I'm really excited to have Michael Hidalgo join us. Michael knows how to help leaders communicate so that their words don't just avoid disaster, but they actually inspire and connect, whether that's in a boardroom or with your team or with a presentation. Michael helps leaders craft their messages so they matter. Michael's also our banded guide in Denver. It's good to have you, Michael. How you doing this morning?
Doing great. Um, I'll ask you forgiveness now. Out in Denver, we have a lot of wildfire smoke, so or I might hit mute and cough so I don't blow out everyone's eardrums
Or if
while we're
there's
on
just a
today. But it's
haze
great.
that comes around you, we'll know and understand what's happening. Michael, tell us about what you do. Tell me about your kind of background. What made you want to get into helping leaders with communication?
Yeah. So the last 26 years, I worked as a pastor, both a teaching pastor and a lead pastor. And in that time, I went to film school and studied screenwriting. And when I began learning the principles of how to tell a good story, I realized we could apply this to every sermon I preach. And that's exactly what I did. And over time, to my surprise, I had not only pastors, but business leaders in our church coming to me and saying, "Can you help me write a talk? Can you help me craft a talk?" And that turned into what's now my company called Speakersmith, where I not only do speaker coaching, but I do speech writing, I do brand narration, I help investors work on pitches to investors, and really learning how do we craft a story, not just tell good stories.
Yeah, that's great. So important, right? Like, uh, there is so much just the one thing that we're constantly doing is communicating, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the one thing that's always happening with us, whether that's in the midst of just a coffee conversation with somebody, or yeah, like yesterday, we had our banded group meeting, and it was just beautiful. We had 4 hours with 12 guys in a room, and everybody's communicating back and forth. There's amazing conversations happening. Everybody's trading leadership principles. There's just so much good stuff that happens in the midst of that. Uh, what what has been for you the driving force into wanting to help business leaders communicate better? Like, why is this so important to you?
Yeah, there's a Jewish both rabbi and philosopher named Abraham Joshua Heschel who used to tell his daughter Susanna, who's now a professor, that words create worlds. And he based that off of Genesis chapter 1, that God spoke this world into existence, but also realized that words have the power to create worlds. And what I've learned is that whether it's my marriage, my business, my friendships, that when communication clicks and communication comes together, that the gap of misunderstanding is closed, that organizations learn how to speak the same language, that teams begin to trust each other more, that innovation and ideas flourish. And so the more I can help people reach clarity in their communication, I really believe we're going to build better worlds, because when my wife and I are communicating better, our marriage is better. When a team leader or a CEO is communicating better to their staff and their teams, they're going to have deeper relationships of trust. And so that's really behind it. I deeply believe in the power of the spoken word.
Yeah, yeah. Language creates culture, and
Mm-hmm.
what you say matters in every conversation. Well, Michael, I would love for you just to jump in to give us some content. I know you have some things that you want to teach, and the way we'll operate today is Michael will teach a little bit, share some things. If you're watching live, feel free to drop any questions in and we'll answer any questions that you have. And then I'll jump in just with some thoughts and with some questions. But Michael, you want to walk us through some of your material?
Yeah, for sure. Um, so I mentioned I had been a pastor for 26 years. And from the day that I started preaching, I heard people say to me, oh, the sermon's going to go away. No one's interested in hearing long form narrative anymore. And then it only got worse as social media began popping up. And then we had Vines and then TikTok and then Reels and everything else. But one of the things I knew is that whatever you want to call a talk or a message, you can call it brand narration, keynote, sermon, speech, lecture. We've been doing this as human beings for thousands and thousands of years. That it started where our ancestors would tell stories around campfires, and then they would mentor younger people in the tribe to become the storyteller, to pass on the story of the tribe. And so we've used long form narrative as long as we've been around. And now today you have the emergence of podcasts, some of which go for 3 hours. You have like Nate Bargatze will be in Denver in a couple of months, and he's packed out Ball Arena, which seats 20,000 people. I mean, we are still deeply interested in the spoken word. And when I spoke about being in film school, what I realized is yes, we have good stories and we can tell good stories, and those are necessary. But if we learn to frame our entire talk or our message in or as a story, we're going to do a lot better. So, an example of that is I worked with a CEO of a healthcare tech startup. A couple of weeks ago, we spent a day in a boardroom where we had whiteboards as walls, and we built a 3-minute story about his product. And so, one of the things I spoke with him about at the very beginning was how do we get our entire talk down to just one sentence? And the shorter that sentence is, the better. Now, I don't know if many of you are familiar with pastors, but pastors often have the reputation of being long-winded. And so when I started teaching this, people began thinking, like, I have a 45-minute talk. How do I boil it down to one sentence? And this is not the elevator pitch. This is literally one grammatical sentence. And it really is, what is your talk going to be about? Or you can maybe ask, what do you want people to leave thinking about? And it can feel confining, and it is probably some of the most difficult part of crafting and creating a narrative or a talk or a message. But in doing it, it allows for more creativity. And here's why. Um, Depending on what you're talking about, you probably have a million ideas or a bunch of stories or loads of information. When I work with authors, they have 45,000 words in a book. But the question is like, well, what are you going to do with that? Like, how are you going to really boil that all down? And I always say the sentence is the great clarifier. That one sentence is what gives you clarity, not only when you're telling people what you're going to talk about, but actually for the entire talk itself. Because once you have that sentence down, you're going to see how the content you have connects to that idea, that central idea, or it doesn't. So then you can filter out what you don't need in the talk, and you can begin moving forward. Because every word that you speak, every example that you give, every story you tell, every question you ask, it needs to move the talk forward. And we'll go through the structure in a little bit. And so I say, if it's really, really good, but it doesn't move the talk forward, then cut it out. Stick it in a file for a later day. because a good story with good information in the wrong place is terrible. I remember one time giving a talk and I told a story that I really liked and I tried to make it fit to that core idea and it didn't. And I could see the like I'm losing the audience as I'm telling the story. I can see them like eyes glazing over because even though it was good, it didn't work because good information, good stories in the wrong place, it just doesn't work. And so if you think about this from a screenwriting perspective, typically when I have more interaction in the workshops I do, I'll ask someone to volunteer to tell me about their favorite movie in 20 seconds or less. And they can do it. They can walk through. If it's Gladiator, there's Maximus. It comes up against Commodus. It's all about Rome. And I bam, bam, bam. They list it out. And then I'll say, what was the last keynote you heard? Can you tell me in 20 seconds or less what it was about? And everyone just freezes because it's really rare to hear a keynote or hear a long form talk and be able to say, yeah, this is what it's about. So this is what I mean, getting this sentence down just to one thing. And in doing this, the thing to consider as you do is remember that you're not a speaker, you're a solutions provider. I learned this from Jake Thompson, who's a friend of mine and a keynote speaker, that when we approach it this way, it really begins to reframe the way we think about it. We are providing a solution through our message. And so if we can think about that, all of a sudden we're going, oh, if there's a problem or there's an issue, this is what I'm addressing. And this is really the first part of building out the sentence. And so I want to walk through this and then we'll pause, kick it back to Ben, see if you have any questions. The first one is, what's the issue you're going to address? And this, by the way, doesn't have to be massive and cataclysmic and something that's impacting everybody in their life. I actually had a conversation with my neighbor recently. He's a VP of marketing for a tech group. And the CEO was supposed to give a talk, got sick, lost her voice, and he had to do it. And so he called me and said, can we spend 20 minutes together? And this is what we went through. So I said, well, what are you going to talk about? He said, onboarding. And I was like, in my head, I'm like, that's the most boring thing I've ever heard. I said, okay, onboarding. So then I said, why do you have to address onboarding? Because if there's no problem, if there's no issue, you probably don't have to do it. And so he began talking about the challenges of onboarding and how long it takes and the cultural piece and the money it costs every company. And I said, okay, so what solution are you bringing to it? And he said, well, we just have a brand new onboarding automation software. So he really wanted to get to that first. And I said, nope, you need to really make sure people understand the problem or the issue, then begin talking about your product. And so then I said, if someone buys your product, what is life going to look like when that issue is solved? And this is the key part in developing the sentence, because a lot of times, which is where my neighbor got stuck, he was focused just on the product. When I worked with that healthcare CEO last week or a couple of weeks ago now, he was focused only on his product. And I said, no, actually, what you're doing is you're casting vision for what life can look like if they adopt your solution. And so I have a talk that I do about burnout. And this is what I came up with for my sentence to give you an example. And then I'll hit pause for a second. So when people would say to me, I'm at a conference or you're in the green room, whatever it is, oh, what are you talking about? And I would just say burnout is rampant in the workplace, but by learning healthy habits, we can thrive in business and life. That quick. And then it was interesting. Almost everybody would say, oh, say more about that, which gave me an opportunity then to give a little bit more of a preview of my talk. But what's the problem? Burnout is rampant. What's the solution? Healthy habits. What's the vision? That you can thrive in business and in life. So I'll stop there and see if there's any questions. And I don't know, Ben, if you have any or any
Yeah.
thoughts.
No, this is great. So helpful. You talked about how storytelling's the most one of the most powerful tools a leader can use. Why do you think leaders undervalue that? And how can leaders start kind of weaving storytelling into their everyday communication? Especially when you think about just kind of elevating the pain point. I mean, that's something that all leaders are doing is leaning into this is the problem that our company solves. This is the one thing that we do. And so, how do you help leaders get better at telling the story of their company?
Yeah, well, there's a fella named Ian McGilchrist who I think he's a British psychologist who's done a lot of study on the human brain. And one of the things he's observed about Western culture is we love data and information. And so it was the genesis of a lot of TED Talks. So research shows, the data suggests, and what he found is our brains are actually wired to receive information in a more potent way through telling stories.
Hmm.
That when we receive new information, it goes into the right side and we receive it in a larger, bigger context. It kicks it over to the left, and that's where we have the data crunching. And then the left side kicks it back to the right for us to integrate it into our world. And so what he pointed out is we're a left brain culture. We're always just starting with the data crunching. And he said, then you have no context to put this new information into. And so one of the reasons one of the things I'll talk about with my clients is, yes, you have a lot of data or your research backs up why your product is going to skyrocket. Ultimately, you're not helping people see it in their context and you're not helping them integrate it into their workflow or into their workplace. And so when I help them, the two things I really have to help them on is understanding that we are, as human beings, are storytelling creatures.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's interesting. The Bible is not a bullet point list of what you're supposed to believe.
Yeah.
Like, the Gospels are just endless stories.
Meals and
And
stories, right?
yeah, exactly. And stories over meals.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the piece. And then the second part is, especially, I know so many of these leaders have spent years of education and research and work to develop a product. So they're so excited about it, but really helping them to see, what is your product going to create in the world?
Yeah.
How is it going to like change the way I work, the way I operate? How is it going to benefit me? Because at the end, we all want to know, ultimately, is this going to make things, my company, my marriage, my life, whatever it is it going to make that better?
Yeah.
And so really in that, what we're doing is we're going into the right brain, kicking it over to the left brain with solutions and kicking it back to the right for how to integrate it into your world.
Yeah. Every company has a story. And there literally is a story war going on every day of whoever tells the best story. I mean, it literally translates into business in so many different ways.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm curious, just when you think about leadership, I've always been taught that as a communicator, you want your words to be both meaningful and memorable. You kind
Mm-hmm.
of want to have clarity and charisma. And that's difficult sometimes. So as a communicator myself, like there's a lot of times when you were talking about the right placed story of knowing when to, you can't just speak in stories. There has to be some clarity and there has to be some other pieces in there. Um, I've been on stages before where I feel like I'm losing the audience, and then I'm like, okay, I got to just tell a story here. Just start throwing out stories, right?
Yeah.
I got to tell a joke here. I got to throw something else in here. How is it more important to be clear or compelling? And uh, can you give an example of how to balance both of those things? Because I think there's times when you're communicating and you just feel like, man, I'm just throwing out data and facts and this is boring, or we're in a meeting and this feels dry. I got to spice this up a little bit. And then there's other
Yeah.
times when you're like, I just got to drive home this point. So clarity or charisma, how do you balance the two of them? And what, just speak into that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I would say if you are clear, you're going to be compelling.
Okay.
Now, are there people that are more charismatic on the stage who are better presenters? Of course there are.
Yeah.
But I just spoke with a colleague of mine who she does speaker coaching and she focuses really on the delivery piece. And she told one of her clients that she goes to conferences and will just like I was going to say stalk, but really observe speakers just to get the lay of the land. She went to one conference and she said, out of listening somewhere to like 7 or 8 speakers, there were only two that told the story,
Hmm.
which is bonkers.
Uh,
And
Yeah.
Her point was to her client, if you can tell two stories, you're going to be so far ahead of everybody else.
Yeah.
And so I think that's part of the piece. The other piece, when it comes to that, clarity, charisma, compelling, is one of the things. Probably this is probably 8 or 9 years into my work as a pastor. People would say to me, "I don't know why, but I always remember your sermons." And I started to figure out, oh, it's because of the way I structure all of them. I structure them like a movie. And so I think some of that, being compelling or clear or charismatic can really help. Because if you think about it, like the movie The Patriot with Mel Gibson, Braveheart also with Mel Gibson, the Gladiator with Russell Crowe, I'm like, those are all the same story.
Yeah.
It just is taking place in a different time frame and in a different culture, but they're all built on the same narrative arc. Almost every Disney Pixar film, same narrative arc.
Hmm.
Most of the Marvel movies, same narrative arc,
Yeah.
and that's the foundation on which I build every single talk, and it's why we can remember the movies, not just because it's visual, but because ultimately it's telling a larger story that we as humans have known internally for thousands of years.
Yeah. So good. So good. I'm gonna let you jump back in, and then I'll jump in with some
Okay,
questions. Anybody watching live, feel free to drop some questions in also.
great. So let's talk about the structure of a talk. I just mentioned that to Ben. That what is the structure? And this is the part where I want to suggest when I work with speakers, especially those who've done some speaking, they push back on this. I actually just worked with a tier 1 SWAT team member who works for the police, Denver Police Department. And when I walked him through this, he said, "Well, I already have my way of doing things," which usually I'll disagree with clients. I was a little more nervous with him, but I pointed out this actually allows for spontaneity. So back to your question, Ben, about when do I insert a story? If we have the structure down and we understand it and we know what parts of the talk are going to do what, that allows us to be more comfortable when we're talking and to read the audience a little bit more. Um, so don't get ahead of yourself. I always say, once we master something, or at least are comfortable and good with something, then we can begin the innovation. I always say, like, you don't start doing wheelies on a bike, you start with training wheels. So this is what the structure does. It allows for the talk to flow, and it's a move away, especially if you're public speaking, from classic speech structure. So classic speech structure is state the thesis, give 3 to 4 supporting points, maybe throw some stories in there, and then have a conclusion. This is what's called the narrative arc. And one of the things I found fascinating is I studied this in film school. And then years later, I read a book written by a fellow named Jack Meserow. He was an education professor at the University of Columbia. And he talked about how adult humans learn. And it's ultimately in 3 parts. And this has been used, by the way, in other places, but he broke it down into 10 stages that really fit into 3 movements. And it's orientation, meaning we understand the way the world works. Disorientation is we have some kind of interruption or disruption in our life that disorients us. And then there's a reorientation where we learn to integrate the new learning. One of the things that's really important about this is that he pointed out if we are disoriented continually without any reorientation, we actually numb out. Like we stop having the ability to learn. This is why, really shocking people in culture, whether it's like Marilyn Manson or can't remember the old radio DJ, Howard Stern, all these shock jocks, they have a shelf life because all they're doing is disorienting. They're not reorienting. And so, as a speaker, as a communicator, as someone who's going to meet with an investor, whoever it is, how do you appreciate or recognize where they are currently oriented, bring some disorientation to them, and then reorient? This has also been called I've heard it in different contexts in the religious world. Richard Rohr is one of them that talks about this. There's order, disorder, order, reorder. This is actually also found in nature, that if you have a ecosystem that's at stasis, it's orderly, and then you have an invasive species or some kind of weather event that comes in and it disorders it. and then it will reintegrate even the invasive species to reorder itself. All of this is connected to this three-part story, which is what Joseph Campbell, if you've ever heard of the hero's journey, um, or the hero with a thousand faces is what he calls it, later known as the hero's journey. Campbell said there's largely one story that we as human beings have been telling across time and civilizations for thousands of years. And he called it the monomyth, that there is some kind of departure from a world that we find the hero in. This is where we meet the hero. They're in their ordinary world. There's some kind of departure. Usually that involves them going into an uncomfortable place. There's an initiation where through tests, trials, meeting allies, finding enemies, they really learn through the school of hard knocks, we might say. And then once they've gone through that descent, usually into some kind of suffering or pain or trial, that's where they discover something new and they can return back to the real world or back to their village, as he said, with something that brings healing and helps people move ahead. I already said this is the narrative arc that you see in everything. If you want to learn more, by the way, about this, a really easy way to learn what I just talked about with Joseph Campbell, there's a great book called The Writer's Journey, and it's written by Chris Vogler, Vogler, and he simplifies Joseph Campbell in a way I've never seen anyone do it. But you can go deeper. There's 12 stages, but it breaks down into these three. So why am I saying all of that? It's because of this. When we think about a talk, we want to think about it in three acts. This comes from Sid Field, who was a screenwriting guru, and he's the one who began helping screenwriters plot how they're going to write this 2-hour screenplay. And this is the exact model that is in one of his books that I drew when I started preaching. And I would write out, where are people oriented? So I'm going to talk about forgiveness. What do we think about forgiveness? Every time I preached on it, it was a really difficult topic. What do we think about burnout in the marketplace? I'm doing a keynote in November about leading change and communicating through change. Well, what do we think about change? So this is the orientation piece. Now, this second piece is called the inciting incident. This is from Sid Field as well. And it's what's the thing that's disruptive to people? What's the thing that's going to create a little bit of tension? What's the thing that's going to make them maybe tilt their head sideways or raise some eyebrows or say, I'm not sure about that. One of my clients just gave a talk on wellness, and his inciting incident is wellness is not something that we go after and we eventually find. Wellness is a verb. It's a way of living our lives. He told me when he said that, people in the audience tilted their head and were like, what? And that's exactly what you want the inciting incident to do. The inciting incident is when Maximus from Gladiator goes home and he's now a slave. Marcus Aurelius is dead, and his wife and child are murdered, and his house and estate is burned. He's kicked into a new world. Now, here's the important part. And once I get through this slide, I'll pause again and Ben and I can talk, or if you have any conversation or any questions. You want to create rising tension after that inciting incident. So you don't want to go right into your solutions. So back to another example I used earlier with my neighbor, onboarding costs companies millions of dollars every year. If you adopt our solution, we'll save you millions. Like, if you if you create tension, you now have to answer and respond to the tension that people are feeling. Using film as an example, if in the movie Gladiator, right after Maximus goes home and discovers his wife and child killed, if he had gone back to Rome and killed Commodus in the arena, you'd have been like, that's the worst story I've ever seen, because you need the tension. And by allowing the tension to sit and by acknowledging the tension in your audience, you are now able to meet their objections and help them recognize that you see them, that you understand them. So an example would be when I give a talk about communicating through change, I'll begin acknowledging things like, how many of you have been in a room where your boss comes in and they talk about a new project or a new product or a new way of doing business, and they're really excited and they leave the room and you sit there and go, how in the world are we ever going to do that? That if I don't start naming those things, people are going to be less likely to adopt my solution or my insights because they're thinking, well, you don't know what I know. You don't know that we've tried this before. So it's really important. A lot of talks fail right here, right in the middle of the rising tension. And it's only after you do that that you can make the shift to introduce your insights. They're still disoriented, but now you're leading them toward this reorientation part by bringing in what are your insights, what are your solutions, what are the things that you're thinking about. And from there, then you can reorient them to their world. You can still recognize, yeah, you're still going to have to onboard people, but now by streamlining this and automating this, you're going to save yourself millions and you're going to have higher performing teams because your employees now know and will learn more quickly the culture and the role that they're supposed to play in the company. And this same model goes through of what's the problem, what's the solution, and what is your life going to look like. So I'll pause there again and kick it back to Ben or any of you.
Yeah, this is great. Love the arc of story, the Joseph Campbell stuff. All that stuff is all so fascinating. The worst part about it though is when you learn the arc of a story, you can predict every movie. You're able to know what's going to
Yeah.
happen in every single movie that you watch. Help me out, Michael, with just everyday communication, right? So
Mm-hmm.
just I feel like leaders naturally communicate, and they oftentimes, if I've got a board meeting or if I've got a just a meeting with my team, and I've got, I'm not going to prepare for hours on this. I'm just going to take a 5 minute spot. What would your advice be just before you enter the room? Think about this, and this.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. What I would say is, again, if you're going into a boardroom and you're given a slot on the agenda, they want you to talk about something. So, what is that issue? What is that topic? What is that problem? Why do they want you to address it? And one of the things, and I'll click on this, it's jumping ahead just a little bit. But when you think about those films, and you talked about Ben, how it ruins it, typically, if you're following Sid Field's formula, which is a lot of people do, 25% are of your talk is on that problem. 50% is on that rising tension and solution, and 25% is the return. So if you have a 5 minute slot, you have, if I'm doing my math right, somewhere in the neighborhood of a minute and a half.
Hmm.
So what are you naming for people? And then why is this problem still exist in our company? Or why is this issue still happening with our teams? And acknowledging that. And then the question is, what solutions do you want to bring? Or what questions do you want to ask the team to really start conversation going? And what would your company be like? What would your teams be like? What would your execution be like if you can overcome this? You can think about it. Let's say you have an employee who's underperforming. So you, instead of walking in saying, you're not doing a good job, you need to do these things or else, like, okay, so name the like, hey, you're underperforming. And when you think about acknowledging or raising the tension and acknowledging the objections, you can say things like, I've seen you try X, Y, and Z, or
Yeah.
I've seen times where you performed really well. I want to understand better what's going on. That's this idea of like you're removing some of the obstacles. And then you can have this conversation and in your head now get to what my mentor used to call solution side. What are the solutions?
Hmm.
And then begin saying, like, okay, if you do this, what do you think is going to happen? I had a coaching client just the other day who was complaining about an employee, and he compared himself to his mentor, and his mentor used to spend an hour with him and teach him. And I said, how did you feel with that? He said, inspired and motivated and valued. And so I said, what would your life be like if your employees were inspired, motivated, and valued? So I was painting the picture of
Yeah.
that reorientation. And I think a lot of times that's where we really fail is yes, there's a problem. People are frustrated. Maybe we let down a client, but ultimately, what does it matter? And if
Yeah.
there's no vision on the other side of it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. That's a really helpful just three-part grid to think through. Uh, Virtual communication is becoming a big deal for leaders with most people, moving offices off-site. Everybody's got Zoom fatigue. Everybody's on Zoom all day. What advice
Hmm.
would you give to leaders who are leading virtual meetings, doing hybrid work, trying to motivate teams when they're not in person? What's different about how leaders communicate virtually versus in person? And what tips would you give to leaders just thinking about communicating virtually?
Yes. Well, virtually, when you're leading virtually, you use what Edward T. Hall, who was a communications theorist, called the fourth dimension. You lose body language, you
Yeah.
lose context. So I'm in Denver, you're in Atlanta. Ken, who's making this whole thing work, is north of Chattanooga. I don't know where everyone else is. So you don't just lose body language, but you lose context. So if we were meeting here in person and I said something about, hey, sorry if I cough, you know, the smoke, everyone would nod their head. But I had to give more explanation. And I think often what happens in virtual meetings is there's a lot of assumption going on
Hmm.
about people are picking these things up. It's a lot harder for people to pay attention.
Yeah.
Like right when we got on the call early, Ben, I told you that I was all of a sudden on this text thread about playing golf tomorrow, and my screen's going crazy with a million text messages. And so all of that is competing for our attention. So I
Yeah.
would say a couple of things are helpful. One, remember every word is a vehicle for information. So I load it with my meaning, I send it to you, and you unpack it through your experience. And the gap between those two things is where miscommunication lives.
That's good.
You can get away with a lot more in person of the gap between the meaning and your experience, because again, there's a lot more context for us to draw from. So in leading virtual meetings, one of the questions I always encourage my clients to ask is not, is that clear? Or are you tracking? Or are you with me? But to say, I'm gonna I'm gonna hit pause for a second. I want you to tell me what you heard me say, because
Hmm.
that's a very different thing.
Yeah.
Now, there's a good chance a lot of people are not going to say back to you what you said. And then I always say to them, don't say, oh, you weren't listening. Say, okay, I probably didn't communicate that well, because now you're closing the gap. And a lot of times the question becomes, well, when do I pause? When do I invite a question? How do I continue to move the conversation forward? Well, follow the three parts of any good story.
Yeah.
Now, you might be like, this is not a story, it's a meeting. Yeah, but we can talk about why are we here? What are we going to do about it? What are the next steps? It can be that simple to really just frame, because again, the way our brain works is it is hardwired for storytelling. If you're a nerd like me, you can Google when you get off the call why our brains crave storytelling. And there's tons of neurological studies in the last 10 years that show we follow stories far more. And stories are built on a structure that human beings innately understand.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. I'm gonna let you jump back in to teaching us some more.
Yeah, yeah. All right, let me find my place here. Um, so here's what I want to say is when it comes, the most important part is when it comes to the return. I don't want to say the most important part, a very important part is when it comes to the return, because this is the so what. This is why does it matter? And one of the tricks here is twofold. Is first, you can't spend a really long time getting to it. Meaning you need to get there in a way that makes people stay with you. So you've given them solutions, but if the solutions hang on too long and you don't get to the ending quick enough, people will begin to tune out and they'll actually go back to some of the objections they have. They're now going to go, wait a second, this software is not going to do that. Or, oh, don't you remember the software that came out in 2000, whatever. So one of the really important pieces is to remember, make sure that when you make that turn, I'll use this slide right here, where you're landing the plane, as we call it, and giving that vision, that you do it quickly. Now, if you think about, again, I'll keep using Gladiator as an example. The ending of Gladiator, if you think about it, is pretty abrupt because it's a long film. So if you haven't seen it and I'm spoiling the end, I'm not going to say sorry because you've had like 20 plus years to watch it. But um, you have Maximus kills Commodus, and then Maximus dies. His body is carried out of the arena, and then one of his gladiator friends comes in and buries these sacred treasures of Maximus on the floor. That's it. Like that's the end. And now the whole thing was building toward Maximus restoring the glory of Rome, but you never see the glory restored. And what the filmmaker did, in this case it was Ridley Scott, is he allowed you to walk out of that film and imagine what could happen. Now, that doesn't mean that you spent the next 6 days dreaming about the glory of Rome, but you knew where the whole story was headed, and you were invited into the story to go, oh, it's happening. But it was left unfinished, if that makes sense. If Ridley Scott had come on before the credits and said, now I want to tell you why we ended the film this way. So now that Commodus is dead and started explaining things, you would have been like, this is the worst thing. Let me sit with the ending. And so I point that out because it not only happens quick, but we have to send people with something to talk about. And so I've long said that the end of any talk should be the beginning of conversation. And so when you're casting vision, again, it's not telling people, here's what my product is going to do, or here's what the solutions will do for you. It's leading them to that place. And then one of the powerful things I felt or I've experienced is one of two things: telling a story about someone who's adopted these practices or has used this product or is really considering the insights that you offered. So the product pitch that we just created for this healthcare startup, the way that we move people into the end is we figured out one of the biggest objections was finances. So people just don't have the budget to adopt this software. Well, we put on a CEO of a rural hospital network from Middle America comes from one of the most under-resourced group of hospitals. And we didn't have time to say all of that, but had her say it in one sentence, and she talked about the cost effectiveness of adopting this and how it overcame their budget objections. And that was all in about 15 seconds. She said that, and then she talked about what it has freed their hospital up to do for their patients. And so again, how do you begin telling a story that makes people go, oh, what would this look like in my world? Or could I imagine what this would be like? The second effective way is to ask questions. Is it possible? What if? Can you imagine? And one things that questions do, especially at the end, is it gives people a choice, but not a choice about making a choice. That you're engaging them. And so now they can't disagree with you when you ask them a question. They might think it's a stupid question, but they can't disagree with you. They have to answer it. And if we can focus our questions on inviting them to consider what would happen if, for example, in my burnout talk, what would happen if you adopted these healthy habits? What could your life look like? Can you imagine being 22% more productive at work in only 10 days? I mean, those kind of things, like what would you do with the rest of your time? So it's inviting those questions, because I always believe the best part of any talk, any branding, any message that you give are the conversations that happen after, because that's when people are wrestling. And if someone can walk out of your talk or watch your brand video or whatever it is, and they're not talking about it, then it's not a very good talk. So back to you, Ben.
Yeah, I'm wondering when you talk to leaders and are working with leaders on their communication pieces, what are the most common blind spots that you see leaders have around communication? What are the things that they're not recognizing that they're doing, or how are they slowly kind of actually hurting themselves in the way that they communicate?
Yeah, I would say the number one thing is focusing on their solution far and away.
Yeah.
So onboarding is a problem. Here's our product. No one is going to go, oh, that's awesome. I should buy that.
Yes.
And the second piece is, and it's tied to it, is that they get to that solution too quickly. So every leader I know, no matter what business they're in, always can recognize, I should say every strong leader I know recognizes where the growth areas are for themselves as leaders and for their company. And there is always good reasons as to why the problems exist.
Yeah.
And so if we skip over those reasons, or we don't acknowledge their objections or their kind of skepticism about what we're talking about, we'll never break through to them. And when we focus on the product too quickly, that's why we don't overcome those objections. I think the other thing is, and I said it earlier, we like as a culture, we love data, absolutely love data. But there was research that came out from the University of Michigan in the early aughts. I can't remember exactly what year it was. And it's called backfire. That if somebody has a wrong-headed view of something and it's demonstrably false, that when we present opposing data or data that tells them they're wrong, they actually root themselves more deeply in their previous belief. Like they become more wrong. And again, back to, well, I mean, for example, if I said to Ben, or I said to you, Ben, like, hey, man, tell me about yourself, you would not start with the data.
Yeah.
You wouldn't give me your address and your height and weight and everything that's on your driver's license. You would start telling me stories. And why do we do that? It's because stories are the thing that changes everything. And that's not me just trying to sound romantic. It's now it's physiological and neurological research that shows
Yeah.
what changes mind is our stories. And I think we tell ourselves, and I've heard people say that I'm not a good storyteller. And I'm like, you can become one because you're wired for stories.
Yeah.
Seriously, it's one of the reasons I love the gospel so much is sometimes the Bible's like backward and primitive and ancient, and then other times like way ahead of its time. And I'm like, Jesus could have come as anything. And I heard John Ortberg say one time, and he came as a storyteller,
Mm.
that most of his teaching, he's telling stories, really provocative stories that change lives.
Yeah. So good. So good. I keep hearing you come back to the principle of keep talking about the problem. Keep talking about the problem. And for leaders, there is this piece of understanding that we have to have of we have to speak our customers' language. We have to know their pain points. As you're talking about that, I feel like there's so many times where we jump to like, here's the features, here's our differentiators, here's our product market fit, all of these things that don't matter to the everyday person as much as what problem are you solving for me and what makes your product better than what I'm currently whatever solution I'm trying to step into now. What is the thing that you're doing that's there? I think leaders also get into this. There's so much jargon for business
Mm-hmm.
leaders, right? That
Oh, yeah.
there's everybody's got it's kind of like churches vision statements. They're all the same, right? It's just like there's all of these things that are just it's just like buzzwords that we're using over and over again. How do you get out of the buzzwords and the jargon trap and get down to like crystal clear communication around vision and those kinds of things? So just like thinking more about like I'm creating a vision statement, I'm writing copy, I'm sending an email, I'm doing the things that leaders are doing all the time. How do I get out of that jargon, buzzwords kind of space and get to real communication?
Yeah. I I cut my teeth preaching to middle schoolers back in like
Who
1998 or
are the
9.
meanest mammals on the planet, right? They like
Oh, they are. They're also just they're amazing, amazing human beings. Like it's what a weird time of life.
they will tell
But
you
I
whether you're good or bad instantly.
100%. And they don't pretend to pay attention.
Yes.
And my mentor said to me, if you can make a group of middle schoolers pay attention, like the sky's the limit. And one of the things I realized is they wanted it like plain Jane. They wanted it everyday talk. And because of their intellectual and development and their lack of maturity, right? Just as adolescent kids, you couldn't bring in huge ideas. You had to distill them. And so one of the things I see often is people throw around the jargon. And if you're speaking, even this is just to your team, if you throw out a term and one person on that team doesn't know what it is, they instantly assume everyone else does because we're nodding our heads because we don't want to stand out, and they feel alienated and isolated.
Mm,
If you use that same term and then say, what I mean by that is, now you sound like a know it all expert. So
hmm.
it's like you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't.
Yeah.
And so what I work to do and what I've asked people and invite people to work to do is define whatever word you're talking about and don't use the word. Because the people then that you're communicating to who know, oh, he's talking about SaaS, will just be like, oh, yeah, I get it. For the people who don't know, they'll feel totally included. So it's a win win at that point.
Yeah.
But I always say, imagine you're talking to middle schoolers, to your high schoolers. My daughter's 15, sophomore at the school down the street here. She doesn't care about jargon.
Mm-mm.
And I mean, here's another example. Um, Nobody heard Jesus's parables and struggled to imagine the scene he created. Every example he used was from the most common, everyday, ordinary life
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
people who were listening, which is why he was such a brilliant teacher because no one felt left out.
Hmm.
So then when he says, like, suppose you're plowing a field, well, everyone, if they hadn't plowed a field, they knew exactly where it was. There was a man who had two sons. One of them said, you know, all of these things, the road to Jericho, they're all images. They all get it. And he
Yep.
spoke, I say to people, use pedestrian language.
Yeah. It's
Don't
good.
try to sound smart. You'll lose people.
Yeah.
Don't talk down to people by giving them the definition. Just use everyday language.
So good. So
You
good.
can tell I'm passionate about that one, by the
That's good.
way.
No, it's super helpful. And it's, I mean, it's rampant, right? Just that idea of I'm just using jargon, I'm going all over the place. Uh, Michael, if anybody wants to get in touch with you and connect with you, how do they do that?
Yeah, my website is michael-hidalgo.com, Hidalgo. Um, and my email address is just michael-hidalgo.com. One of the things I always tell people, the most common error that people make um, is they spell my last name Hildago, Hildago.
Hmm.
You will get a bounce back. Or they miss the little hyphen between Michael and Hidalgo. I had to put that there because the guy who owns michaelhidalgo.com wants like $3,000, and I'm I'm just not
Not
paying
willing,
that.
not willing to
So yeah,
pay that
that's
for the
it.
hyphen.
Yeah, that's
That's
it.
great.
But yeah, it's the easiest way to get a hold of me.
Awesome, awesome. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for teaching today. If any of you are in the Denver area, Michael is our guide and one of our guides in Denver. Dan Anderson is an amazing leader in Denver, also starting a group there. So if you're interested in jumping in Bandit, if you're in the Denver area, you could have Michael as your leader for your Bandit group, which would be pretty cool. So, Michael, thanks so much. Appreciate you
Yeah,
being
thanks
with
for having
us.
me.
Appreciate you sharing. And everybody have a great week.
Bye, everybody.